So it's my pleasure to introduce our final session this afternoon, Dr. Vincent J. Miller, who I also think we owe a debt of gratitude for his organizing efforts today. So please join me in thanking Vince for all his good work to bring us together. Vince is the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture here at the University of Dayton. Dr. Miller was appointed as the first Gudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture in 2009. He came to the University of Dayton from Georgetown University, where he was an associate professor of theology. He served as a distinguished visiting professor at UD in the spring of 2008. He's the author of Consuming Religion, Christian Faith and Practice in a Consumer Culture from 2003, and is currently working on a book about how globalization is affecting religious belief and communities. He's going to present to us today, and I should also just thank Vince for including me sort of as a late addition to the program. It's been really enriching for me to come down. My colleagues at Ohio State are still trying to figure out whether I'm really allowed to talk about religion and the science and the environment all at the same time, but certainly at a place like University of Dayton, we expect this. But he's going to be talking to us about integral ecology, Francis's moral and spiritual vision of interconnectedness. Join me in welcoming Vince.
Thank you, Greg. So my theme is Pope Francis' notion of integral ecology, which I'm going to argue is I suspect better to say, a spiritual and moral vision of interconnectedness. Integral ecology is the central theme of Laudato Si. It serves as both the foundation of its analysis of the ecological crises we face, and the crystallization of Pope Francis's proposals for responding to these crises. Integral ecology is a vision, a way of seeing and valuing the interconnections among humans and the rest of creation, and the basis for acting in harmony with them. And I really want to stress that order. I think one of the great contributions of this encyclical is not simply to portray ecological destruction as a profoundly important moral issue for the Catholic Church, but to portray awareness of our interconnections with the world as the beginning for responding to them. So it's a question of awareness as the first step before the exercise of the will and moral response. As human beings, we cannot exist alone. We depend upon society and myriad relationships with all of creation for our existence. In turn, our full flourishing is found in returning the gift we have been given by society and creation back to the rest of humankind and the rest of the world. Catholicism has long been known as a communal religion. If some forms of Christianity emphasize the individual soul's encounter with its personal Lord and Savior, Catholicism speaks of shared sacraments and the communion of saints. Pope St. John Paul II spoke repeatedly of the importance of the virtue of solidarity. Solidarity, in his description, is the social dimension of love, of caritas. As a virtue, it describes the ability to see the social dimension of problems and the courage to stand together in community to confront injustice and build shared flourishing. For John Paul, solidarity was based on the underlying fact of human interdependence. We are not born self-sufficient individuals. We are born into families and communities. We are sheltered and nourished, educated and encouraged. All of us depend on others not only for our survival, but for our flourishing. A full human life involves accepting support from our communities and, in turn, making our own contribution back. Integral ecology, I'd like to suggest, can be thought of as the expansion of solidarity from social interdependence with other human beings to human interdependence with the rest of creation. Just as an infant grows into an adult and learns to contribute to the society in which she or he matured, so humankind must now grow to appreciate its interconnection with the rest of creation and contribute and care for the community of creation which sustains it. So integral ecology as it functions in Laudato Si. Francis' understanding of integral ecology is developed throughout the Encyclical, where the term itself is frequently discussed, and in the many uses of its sibling phrase, everything is connected, or everything is interconnected, or about 3 other forms. Francis devotes the entire 4th chapter of the Encyclical to the topic of integral ecology, and it's noteworthy to see that that chapter follows upon the 3rd, the human roots of our ecological crisis, which describes how the narrow focus of our economics and technology contribute to the environmental crisis by ignoring the interconnections among all parts of creation. Francis begins his treatment of integral ecology in contrast with the description of the problem in the previous chapter by noting that we have a need for a, quote, vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, including its human and social dimensions. So what I'll do here today is discuss 3 aspects of Francis' treatment of integral ecology. The first is integral ecology as a set of beliefs about the nature of the world. This is the doctrinal level of integral ecology. Second, integral ecology as a way of seeing, of perceiving, of imagining the world. And third, integral ecology as a moral principle to guide action. These 3 aspects are mutually reinforcing. First, integral ecology as the belief that each creature is a caress of God. As a vision, integral ecology is an understanding and imagination that enables us to perceive the interconnection among all things. This understanding, which I'll describe shortly, is based upon specific doctrines, beliefs, and scriptural themes. Francis traces this understanding to the Hebrew Scriptures, noting how, quote, the laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but with other living beings. Such examples include the obligation to help fallen beasts of burden, the prohibition on simultaneously hunting mothers and their young, even eggs, and Sabbath requirements that even donkeys and oxen be given rest. The ultimate foundation for this vision is belief in God as the creator of all things. Francis cites Thomas Aquinas' argument that the diversity of creatures expresses the infinite goodness of God. The diversity of creatures expresses the infinite goodness of God. This could not be represented, quoting Aquinas, fittingly by any one creature. Only the diverse multitude of creatures in their, quote, multiple relationships, end quote, together convey the goodness of the Creator. Thus, each creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, God's boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. So that's the doctrinal basis, the set of beliefs about why the world is interconnected that undergirds this vision. Let's turn now to the vision, or in his words, a gaze of serene attentiveness. If integral ecology is based upon a certain understanding of the world, it is also literally a way of seeing, of perceiving. It's a certain kind of gaze. Francis speaks of it as, quote, an attitude of heart, which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present. Jesus is the supreme example of this loving gaze. In Francis' words, Jesus taught us this attitude when he invited us to contemplate the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. Or when seeing the rich young man and knowing his restlessness, quote, he looked at him with love, the Gospel of Mark there. Jesus was completely present to everyone and to everything, and in this way he showed us the way to overcome that unhealthy anxiety which makes us superficial, aggressive, and compulsive. There we go. This gaze of Jesus is very important to Pope Francis. The scene of Jesus' encounter with another rich young man, the calling of Matthew, the tax collector, is the basis for Francis' motto on his papal coat of arms and the coat of arms when he was archbishop. His motto is miserando atque eligendo, a phrase that can be roughly translated as by having mercy and choosing him. Francis likes that the Latin word miserando has no easy modern translation in any language. It means by having mercy, or as Francis prefers to translate it, mercying. Jesus' gaze is mercying. He looks upon people and things with a love that sees the fullness of what they are and what they might be. The gaze itself changes things. The gaze sees the best and the fullness of what is there. There's always more to someone and to something than meets the eye. In Matthew's case, the something more is that a wealthy tax collector working for Roman occupiers, at that time a position much closer to an extortionist than a bureaucrat, might become a great apostle and saint. In the case of integral ecology, that something more is seen in patient openness to imagine and to seek to understand the many interconnections among the other creatures with whom we share the world. The mountain, the soil, the tree, the wolf, and the bee are all so much more than the simple objects that meet our eyes in a shallow gaze. And pointing directly back to Leanne's presentation and chapter here. Consider soil. We all know in this room, certainly, that it's much more than dirt, of course. It's where plants grow. We all probably know as well that it's teeming with microscopic life of endless sorts that are essential for supporting that plant growth. There are entire microcosmic ecologies in every thimbleful of soil. As ecologist Aldo Leopold discussed, it's the foundation of a fountain of energy that flows from the sun through the soil, through plants in the soil, through animals, and through our veins as well. No soil, no us. And as Dan said earlier today, the name of the first human in the Bible, Adam, echoes Adama, literally meaning, right, a being of the soil. Integral ecology is a gaze with the patient's openness to learn these connections. This attentive and loving gaze is not limited to Jesus. The more proximate model for integral ecology in the Encyclical is St. Francis of Assisi, whose great prayer poem, The Canticle of the Sun, provides the title for the Encyclical. St. Francis was open to all of creation. He responded to it not with, in Francis's words, mere intellectual appreciation or economic calculus, but with love. In the Pope's word, just as happens when we fall in love with someone, whenever he would gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest of animals, he burst into song, drawing all other creatures into his praise. And that is the source of the poem, and that is the title of the encyclical, right? Together we all praise God. It's not praise to God for these things, right? But it's in these things, with the sun, the moon, the stars, the water. For St. Francis, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. That is why he felt called to care for all that exists. St. Francis' biography is full of stories where he joyfully engaged other creatures, preaching the gospel to fish and birds. He is the patron saint of bird feeders. Long before Lynn White suggested he become the patron saint of ecology. In 1967, in 1979, Pope John Paul II declared him the patron saint of ecology. This is an interesting fact. If you want a wild story of a human being reconciled with the rest of creation, look up the story of Francis and the wolf at Gubbio, in which Francis tamed a fierce wolf that was terrorizing a town, eating their livestock and their children. It sounds like a Catholic fairy tale. Were it not for the decidedly odd fact that 800 years later, the bones of a very large canine were found in an excavation of the town's church cemetery. I don't know what to do with that. Pope Francis argues that there's more here than naive romanticism. This is John August Swanson's seriograph of Francis and the wolf. Pope Francis argues that there is much more here than naive romanticism. Our attitudes of attentiveness and love affect what we see, and thus what we're able to value. This is a path of transformation worth noting for Francis, perhaps for both Francises. Awareness of our relationships is the path to moral transformation. It's not simply a matter of what we love, but that love enables us to see more of reality. To quote the Pope, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. And this is a key point I want to emphasize here. There is the need to limit our consumption, to limit the way we transform the world for our own anthropocentric and selfish needs, right? And a lot of that's going to require asceticism, an exercise of the will, the ability to say no to our own desires. This is a different path being sketched here, right? It's not us leaning against the rudder and saying, no, I'll deny myself more for that. It's open your eyes, open your heart, fall in love with that, and the rest falls in line. If we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously, right? I don't struggle mightily to not eat all the Girl Scout cookies because my children love them, right? So I care about them and I leave some for them. It's much easier. And that's what he's talking about with integral ecology. Can we see those other creatures that we live with? Can we love them? And the rest can follow. On the other hand, if we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationships with the world, he says our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. Integral ecology is a way of seeing that opens our eyes to the myriad creatures with whom we are interrelated. It helps us to understand our interdependence and to see and thus value the rest of creation. This serene gaze is not something we gain all at once. Rather, it is something that is cultivated and developed, to point back to Doug's talk this morning. To quote Francis, nature is filled with words of love, but how can we listen to them amidst constant noise, interminable and nerve-wracking distractions, or the cult of appearances? Francis lists several spiritual practices that can help develop our capacity for serene harmony with creation, such as taking time for quiet, reflecting on our lifestyle and ideals, contemplating the Creator who lives among us and surrounds us. Although Pope Francis is quite critical of the limited, narrow gaze of contemporary economics and technology, and in the fuller chapter I discuss this at great length, it's noteworthy that he does not generally contrast integral ecology with science. He contrasts it with shallow economics, short-term thinking. He contrasts it with the technocratic paradigm, but he does not contrast it consistently with science. One time he does, but mostly doesn't. Rather, Francis portrays integral ecology and science as mutually enriching ways of seeing the world. He opens the chapter on integral ecology with a discussion of the science of ecology. Ecology studies the relationships between organisms and their environment. Francis expands this scientific insight from biological ecology to human society, noting that the existence of human society is as much a matter of relationship with other species as it is a matter of economic development. He presents the dialogue with science as one of the central projects of the Encyclical. In the introduction, he notes that he will draw, quote, on the results of the best scientific research available today, letting them touch us deeply and provide a concrete foundation for the ethical and spiritual itinerary that follows. Again, ethical responsibility here is a matter of being able to see what the problem is, as much as possessing the will to respond to it. This incorporation of scientific knowledge into the vision of integral ecology has a profound spiritual depth. I think the most powerful line in the entire encyclical comes from the 19th paragraph. Our goal is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. Integral ecology draws from scientific attentiveness to creation. Francis believes it can in turn contribute to science as well. He argues repeatedly that the complexities of our current crises can only be solved if all dimensions of human wisdom are brought to bear. Faith has much to contribute, not least of this is the loving and attentive gaze of integral ecology, to seek and to know and love the depths of things in their complex relationships. In this regard, he quotes at length from Lumen Fide, the encyclical he wrote with his predecessor, Benedict XVI, and I leave it to the reader to decide who wrote this paragraph. The gaze of science thus benefits from faith. Faith encourages the scientist to remain constantly open to reality in all its inexhaustible richness. Faith awakens the critical sense by preventing research from being satisfied with its own formulae, and helps it to realize that nature is always greater. By stimulating wonder before the profound mystery of creation, faith broadens the horizons of reason to shed greater light on the world, which discloses itself to scientific investigation. So third, integral ecology as a moral principle then. If integral ecology is a way of seeing the world, what does it show us? It shows us that everything is interconnected. It is a statement about ourselves as much as our environment. Integral ecology requires a rethinking of economics, the standard values of economic thought, addressing human needs through economic growth, a focus on efficiency, must be expanded with, quote, a broader vision of reality that considers the ecological context of all economic activity. And we can think back to the graph that Otmar showed this morning with the parabolas, right, that go down as global mean temperature increases, right? There is no economic growth with 10 degrees global warming. Development that ignores ecological sustainability is likely to be shallow and short-lived. Economic growth alone is not sufficient for the development of social and ecological justice. And here it points back to the term integral development from the encyclical tradition, Paul VI, which I treat more fully in the chapter as well. Francis calls particular attention to the importance of social institutions in this regard. Quote, social ecology is necessarily institutional, and it extends to the whole of society, from the primary social group, the family, to the wider local, national, and international communities. Within each social stratum and between them, institutions develop to regulate human relationships. Anything which weakens those institutions has a negative consequence, such as injustice, violence, and loss of freedom. In addition, and this speaks to Tony's point about the libertarian mindset being fundamentally at odds with the insights of Catholic social teachings, with the Catholic moral tradition, institutions are necessary to serve the common good. In addition to the importance of formal social institutions, Francis calls attention to the importance of broader culture for integral ecology. As the root of the word suggests, culture is not simply an anthropological human category. Rather, cultures have historically developed as ways of life in particular biomes, particular ecological contexts. Arctic cultures are unsurprisingly quite different from tropical ones. Inuit peoples eat fish and whale blubber, and Latin American cultures eat avocados and papayas, and this is not a matter of just sort of personal preference, right? This is because their biomes provide that. That's how you survive. That's how you flourish as a human being in those places with those other creatures. Culture and agriculture are related terms. We forget this after petroleum. Each historical culture embodies a particular form of life linked to a particular context. Ecology, then, in Francis's words, also involves protecting the cultural treasures of humanity in the broadest sense. More specifically, it calls for greater attention to local cultures when studying environmental problems, favoring a dialogue between scientific, technical language and the language of the people. Indigenous cultures are ways of flourishing in the world that are ancient and tied to their particular biomes, to their particular ecologies. There's enormous wisdom there that integral ecology wants to pay attention to. There's a way of being in the world that understands these connections that needs to be attended to. One of the other interconnections disclosed by integral ecology is the relationship between our treatment of the poor and vulnerable, and the environment. Francis has labeled disregard for the poor as the culture of indifference, which he describes as a sin. Indifference is the opposite of integral ecology. It is the same self-centered attitude that leads us to ignore both the poor and the ecology which sustains us. These are two sides of the same coin of indifference. The poor, in Francis's words, are the greatest victims of climate change. because, for very specific reasons, they often rely more directly, quote, on natural reserves and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. When their ecologies are disrupted, their livelihoods collapse and they're forced to become migrants. Many of the mass migrations taking place today, both those dominating headlines and those that are largely ignored, are linked to environmental crises, many of them caused by climate change. Projections into the next century show this trend will grow exponentially. Predictions range from 200 million to 2 billion climate refugees in the next 35 years, and the lifetime of our children. 2 billion people, 1/4 of humankind on the move because of environmental disruption is a very real possibility. Today's headlines are nothing compared to that. If Europe can't take any more Syrians now, 2 billion people on the move, nothing will be the same. Even in more developed countries, the poor and the marginalized bear a disproportionate burden of environmental damage and pollution. In the US, there is a widespread reality of environmental racism, as major sources of industrial pollution are located disproportionately, stunningly so, near poor communities of color. Francis concludes the chapter on integral ecology with a discussion of its relationships with the common good. The common good is a foundational principle in Catholic social and political ethics. It's defined in Catholic social doctrine as, quote, the sum total of social conditions, which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. The common good is not simply the aggregate of individual flourishing. The common good refers to goods that can only be achieved by humans together in society. Examples include justice and culture. You can't have those privately. Neither of these human goods can ever be achieved alone or behind a wall. To exclude anyone from the flourishing sought by the common good undermines the common good. The common good is not common if it's restricted to the privileged. It concerns matters that affect all and require the contribution of all members in order to be achieved. Francis draws a direct contradiction between the common good and the rampant individualism and the concern for instant gratification that marks contemporary consumer societies. The environmental impact of the lifestyles taken for granted in developed nations is profoundly unsustainable, and it demands radical inequality. If every person on earth were to live the average American lifestyle, not the 1%, the average American lifestyle, with a single-family home, automobile transportation, cheeseburgers on demand, and the various gadgets and accoutrements of everyday life, it would require the resources of more than 5 planets. Inequality is taken for granted by everyday life in this country. In addition to the common good among those alive now, integral ecology forces us to face the question of sustainability and the question of justice between generations. What kind of world, Francis asks, do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? What kind of world do we want to leave to the children that are now growing up? He says, doomsday predictions can no longer be met with irony or disdain. We may well be leaving to coming generations debris, desolation, and filth. The pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes, such as those which even now, periodically occur in different areas of the world. The effects of the present imbalance can only be reduced by our decisive action. Here and now, we need to reflect on our accountability before those who will have to endure the dire consequences, before our children. So in conclusion, integral ecology, as I've said, is the central theme of Laudato Si. It is a transformative way of seeing that opens up the interconnections with the rest of creation that sustain us and in which we find our flourishing. By opening ourselves up to the world around us, by attending to it deeply, we can be moved to respond to these connections with respect, love, and care. the path of transformation begins by opening our eyes and attending to the world around us.